So thank you for everybody coming out tonight. This is part of the Institute for Governance and Civics Economic Liberty Speaker Series. We are absolutely delighted to have David Neumark, who's one of the leading scholars in the world on the minimum wage, giving this talk, as you can see, using minimum wages to fight inequality and poverty. So David Neumark is Distinguished Professor of Economics and co-director of the Center for Population, Inequality, and Policy at the University of California, Irvine. He has previously held positions at the Federal Reserve Board, the University of Pennsylvania, Michigan State University, and the Public Policy Institute of California. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's been co-editor of the Journal of Urban Economics, editor of ISA Journal of Labor Policy, and has served on the editorial board of numerous other journals. He is an absolute pioneer in the field of labor economics and minimum wage research, labor market discrimination, and has excellent papers on state enterprise zones. We're delighted to have him, and I hope you can join me in giving him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. So I walked in here and I said, it looks a bit like a comedy club. And someone said, well, do you have any jokes to tell? So I'll tell one just to start, because why not? Because I never get the chance to do comedy. And it's a good joke because it emphasizes, economists' hard-headed view of the world, which, in my opinion, is actually a pretty good thing. So these guys are playing golf, and there's a foursome in front of them, and they're just, every hole, they're just taking forever. And the three people playing golf, one of them's an eye doctor, and one is a lawyer, and one's an economist. And they're getting very frustrated. It's going hours. And finally, the golf course manager comes by, and they say, like, what is going on with these guys? They're going to be out here for 10 hours to play a round of golf. And the manager says, oh, I'm really sorry. They're these firefighters, and a long time ago, they rescued children from a burning house, and they all survived. But because of the terrible accident, they lost their vision. And once a year, we let them play a round of golf. And the eye doctor says, oh, there's some really kind of amazing technology now. I'd be happy to set them up for some pro bono work and see what we can do. And the lawyer says, I hope they got what they deserve. They should. It's an amazing sacrifice. I'd be happy to provide them help to get a settlement. And the economist says, can't they play at night? All right. Anyways, okay. So that's why I give economics lectures and don't do stand-up comedy. All right, so thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk about what is on the title here. So let me just start. I'm going to start with a bit of description of the policy, which might be familiar with you, but some details you may not know. I'm going to talk about the arguments for a higher minimum wage, why we have had and continue to have this discussion about raising minimum wages, and then that, of course, is driven by trying to solve particular problems. And then I'll talk about what the evidence says, as well as alternatives. So first of all, we now have pretty high minimum wages in the U.S. We don't have a high federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage hasn't changed since 2009, which is a long time, especially when we had at least a couple years of quite high inflation. But we have moved to a system of many states, the majority, having minimum wages above the federal minimum wage. States can have a higher minimum wage, just can't have a lower one, and quite high levels. You can see a couple there. They might even be out of date, over $16 in Washington and over $17 in D.C., and I think California goes to 17 in the winter, if I'm not mistaken. We now have a lot of cities with higher minimum wages, which we didn't used to have, and this is all quite new. We had a trickle of this in a few places in the 2000s, but the late 2010s, this really took off. So the federal minimum wage now provides a floor for an increasingly narrow set of states in the South, but not exclusively. It used to be that high minimum wages were Massachusetts, Vermont, California, Oregon, Washington, sort of liberal, coastal, relatively rich, high-wage places. But we're in Florida. The minimum wage is very high here now. There are other southern and central states, red states, that have pretty high minimum wages. So it's no longer just a sort of coastal liberal kind of thing. These heights are the percentage, as of last January, by which the state minimum wage exceeded the federal minimum wage. And you can see, some of you are pretty close, that quite a few of them are above 100, which means they're more than twice the federal minimum wage. So the average difference now is over 80%. So when we're talking about the minimum wage, we're really talking about state variation at this point. Although the debate in DC, because they control the federal minimum wage, is of course about what to do with the federal minimum wage, and we can talk more. I'll touch on that a little bit at the end. Okay, that's just the fact. So why has this been a big issue? Now, it's been a little bit less of a big issue the last few years. 2016, Trump won versus Clinton, was a big period for talking about the fight for 15, a national $15 minimum wage. We still talk about that, not so much at the federal level, perhaps because of all these changes at the state level. Local minimum wages, San Diego, I believe, just passed a 25 minimum for some sectors. Future mayor of New York wants to take the minimum wage to $30. That's a prediction, but I'm pretty sure that's right. So we're still having this discussion, but not so much at the national level. So here's essentially a couple slides which show you both why a lot of people think we should raise the minimum wage, but also some caveats. So the blue line here is the ratio of the 50th to the 20th percentile of the wage distribution. So what does the person at the median make versus the person at the 20th percentile? Okay, so it's kind of a middle versus lower tail spread. And it's sloping up. COVID is weird, you can see that, right? But don't worry about that. But it's sort of sloping up continually since the late 1960s. So the middle of the wage distribution, or the earnings distribution, sorry, has been pulling away from the bottom of the earnings distribution, which leads some to say, hey, we need a higher minimum wage so they can keep up. Now, this can happen for all sorts of reasons. But one thing to note is the orange line, which is the 90-50 ratio, so that's sort of the top versus the middle. Well, that's been going up a lot too, pretty much, except for the kind of the COVID spike. The blue and orange lines are, roughly speaking, going up at the same rate. So inequality is not just a feature of what's going on at the bottom of the distribution. That's important because some people argue, at least at the federal level, that because the federal minimum wage hasn't gone up in so long, we've sort of removed this floor that's exacerbated inequality, and we have to raise it to kind of rein inequality back in. But the minimum wage has nothing to do with the 90-50 spread. The fact is that earnings are just becoming more unequal for all sorts of reasons, which doesn't mean we shouldn't raise the minimum wage. This is not just that the bottom has fallen out because of the minimum wage. If you want to see that in another way, I'm going to go out of order here. This is a Piketty et al. Kind of graph. This is from one of their papers. And what you're seeing here is along the horizontal axis, the income percentile. So if you're at 50, you're at the median. If you're at 100, you're essentially at the top. And the vertical axis is growth. And what you can see here is this is a real growth. I mean, there's different ways to do real growth, but roughly speaking, most people's earnings have been, I don't really think they've been, stagnant or growing a little bit, maybe a little more, depending on how you want to think about prices. But then you can see what happens at the top, 99th percentile, 99.9. This is whatever you think of the conclusions in some of his politics, the genius of what Piketty and Sias have done is to get access to tax data where you can really study the very highest income people. Because in all the public data sources we have, you don't see the earnings reported of people who make tens of millions or hundreds of millions or billions. And what this graph says is that, and this is a somewhat contested issue, but I think fundamentally not wrong. We can argue about the magnitudes. But there has been this remarkable pulling away at the very, very top. And that's a kind of inequality, a lot of us, it depends, may not like that much. It's hard to argue in favor of it. Maybe you can. But the point is, it has nothing to do with the minimum wage, clearly, right? So there's something else going on. One more slide, just back up here. This is a little, is there a pointer on here? Let me see. Maybe not. Okay. I want you to look at this is the upper left graph here is the middle, and that's wages and earnings. Those are the lines that almost completely overlap. I think they're blue and purple. And weeks worked, kind of flat. And then you look at the bottom, and you can see what's happened to wages, the black line, earnings, the blue line. So if you look at earnings, especially say, wow, earnings at the bottom have really plummeted, right, relative to the middle, because here it's flat, right, and here earnings is kind of falling through the floor. But this is weeks worked, and that's what's driving it, not wages, or not entirely wages. And the point is, a lot of the problem of low earnings is not working or working less. It's not only wages. And whether that's in part I mean, it's a lot of things. But the bottom line is less skilled people, and in particular the change that are profound for less skilled men, have been withdrawing from the labor market at extraordinarily high rates, well before what we usually think of as retirement ages, and even though for lower skilled people, retirement ages might be quite young. So the point is inequality, the only point I want to make here is inequality has gone up a lot, and it's gone up for partly because wage dispersion has gone up, something the minimum wage would, in a sense, directly address. But it's also gone up for a lot of other reasons as well. And tackling the inequality problem is therefore a lot more complicated than just the minimum wage, even if you like the minimum wage. Okay. The other fact driving this is that the poverty rate really hasn't changed, right? So the orange line here is real GDP per capita, like how much stuff does the economy produce per person. And that, of course, trends up over time with recessions, except for recessions, and you can see the recessions there. The poverty rate is the yellow line, and it goes up and down a little bit. We see sort of the late 90s, the Clinton boom, poverty fell. First Trump term fell quite a bit. But it looks longer term pretty flat, right? And that's really surprising because the U.S. poverty rate is an absolute poverty measure. It's not a relative measure. It's not the 20th percentile of income distribution. It's sort of it's a weird measure, but it's sort of 3 times of the food basket that a particular family consumes for weird historical reasons. But poverty, as a country gets richer, could go to 0, right? Because it's an absolute measure, right? If it's the 20th percentile, of course, it can never go to 0. And the fact that poverty is pretty persistent has led a lot of people to say we need a higher minimum wage to reduce poverty or to start driving poverty down. And I'll come back to that later. But it suggests all this evidence suggests there's really 2 key arguments for raising the minimum wage, and these are the 2 you typically see. One is to help low-wage workers, and the other is to reduce poverty. Now, those may sound like the same thing, so if you think they are, store that away and we'll come back to it. We'll talk about low-wage workers first. They're actually quite different, and that's an important point often lost in this debate. So how does the minimum wage affect low-wage workers? Well, some people think this is a view. If we raise the minimum wage to $1 million, everyone will be Bill Gates. But most of us think that's not actually the way it works. The cartoons I could find about the minimum wage are all by conservative cartoonists. I don't know why. Anyways, so let's do economic theory for, I think, 3 slides. What does economic theory tell us that the minimum wage should do to low-wage workers? Well, let's even dial it back simpler. When we make things more expensive, except for Giffen goods, people consume less of them. That's almost always true. It's reflected in public policy in a lot of places. We tax cigarettes to discourage use. We tax gasoline, I think in some places more than others, to discourage use. Conversely, we subsidize things like green technology to encourage use. And why? Because we think people are responsive to price, right? And when we make something more expensive, people consume less of it. So that's the obvious potential unintended consequence of a higher minimum wage. When you pass the minimum wage, what you are doing is raising the price of the least skilled workers, right? That's the very simplest view of the world, and that might discourage use of those workers, and that's the problem we have to worry about. When you talk about labor, it's a little more complicated. When I talk about cigarettes or gasoline or an electric vehicle or whatever, that's consumption. We consume things to give us utility, to make us happy. Gets more expensive, we buy our happiness some other way. Labor's a little different. No one hires labor for direct utility, but firms hire labor to make profits. That makes things a little more complicated. We say that labor is a derived demand. The only reason anyone hires a worker in the private sector is because they can make more they can make more profit from that worker. They can make more revenue from that worker than the worker's going to cost them, right? So there's some exceptions, okay? So first of all, the first bullet inherent in the last one, when there's both skilled and unskilled labor, skilled workers might gain, right? You might substitute towards them, right? Because their price hasn't been pushed up. Minimum wages can sometimes be non-binding. California is a high minimum wage, but that minimum wage means a very different thing in San Francisco or in San Jose, very high wage areas, versus the Central Valley, which isn't that different from a lot of lower income states in the U.S. So you might not see much impact of a higher minimum wage in San Francisco or New York City. It doesn't mean we necessarily learn anything about the theory being right or wrong. It may just mean the minimum wage affects so few people that you really can't tell. The big sort of exception is what we call monopsony or friction models or imperfect models, imperfect competition models of the labor market. And these are models where, and we could talk about this for a whole quarter, but we won't, where a minimum wage won't necessarily reduce employment. These models, and I don't want to get into them here, they don't make any firm predictions, but one of the things they also don't firmly predict is that the minimum wage necessarily reduces employment, and those are quite popular these days. My view is the theory, because of all these exceptions and especially these friction models, you got to turn to the evidence. That's always my point of view. That's just my nature. I don't really. I mean, I like theory. I like models to flesh out the logic of an argument. I don't think you draw policy conclusions from theory in and of itself. Okay, so now, longest part of what I want to talk about is, okay, what does the data actually say? Okay. So does the competitive model actually help explain what's going on? So I want to take you through, this is the most researchy part of the talk, or econometrics part of the talk. So how do we figure this out? Well, until the late 80s, we only had pretty much a national minimum wage, a couple of very small exceptions. We also didn't have as much data as we have now, and we didn't have the same kind of statistical tools that we can readily use now. So people studied basically the time series data, the national minimum wage as it changed, and tried to tease out the effects on the low wage workers. Huge body of literature extending. It kind of ended more or less in the mid 80s as we got the emergence of state minimum wages and more data and more computing power. But that work basically said that the elasticity for young workers, usually 16 to 19-year-olds, maybe 16 to 24-year-olds, was about -0.1 to -0.2. So two things, first of all. What's an elasticity? It's defined in yellow there. In this case, it's the percent change in employment over the percent change in the minimum wage. Just a convenient summary measure, because if somebody's studying a $5 increase and somebody's studying a 50-cent increase, and they say employment fell by, X 100,000, we don't have an apples-to-apples comparison. So elasticities are nice that way. Why young workers? Because when we just had the aggregate data, we tended to look, for good reasons, at the workers most likely to be affected, and you may know this, and this should make most of you feel good because most of you are young. Your earnings are lowest when you're young, right? So teenagers are a very disproportionate share of minimum wage workers because they don't know anything yet. They don't have any skills yet. That's what they're worth in the labor market. So that's kind of this earlier consensus, from kind of when I was just finishing graduate school, more or less. But teasing out the effect of the minimum wage from the national data is tricky, right? So you're studying, there's increases in the 60s, there's increases in the 70s. There's a lot of other stuff going on. There's the Vietnam War, there's the creation of AFDC, the welfare program we used to have. Very hard to figure out what's going on. Once states started raising the minimum wages, researchers were kind of drooling because now we have what's called a counterfactual. The counterfactual is always, I see a policy take effect in location, in jurisdiction, state, government, city, whatever, country A. The counterfactual is always the thing I can't see, which is what would have happened in the exact same place had that policy change not occurred. We can't see that because if the policy change occurred, the policy change occurred. But if I have two similar states or two similar cities or whatever, and the minimum wage changes in one and not the other, or any policy, then the one where it didn't change is maybe a pretty good forecast of what would have happened absent the policy change. That's what we mean when we say the counterfactual. And 90, I'm making this number up, but it's probably true, 95% of public policy research that's empirical is basically this kind of strategy, right? Things happen in some locations or periods or whatever and not others, and we take comparable locations or periods or whatever where the policy didn't change, and kind of compare how outcomes change in those two places. So the state minimum wages gave us tremendous leverage over this. This is just kind of a sense of what goes on in the U.S. This is just the number of states with minimum wages above the federal level. And you can see, as I mentioned, big spike here in the late 80s. Then it kind of crawls up, and then a big spike in the 2000s, and then another spike to much higher levels, which you can't see here at the end of the graph. So researchers who study minimum wages love the U.S. because we have all this variation, right? If I'm studying the minimum wage in France, I just have a national minimum wage. Most countries just have a national minimum wage, so we're kind of back to the earlier limitations of how do you figure out what's going on. So you might think that with, great, all that variation, this is a great laboratory to see what's going on. We should have answered this question. Well, we haven't. Here's just a bunch of quotes. The first set of quotes, I mean, there's two, they could find thousands, from the media saying exactly opposite things. Now, one of those is from Forbes, and one of those is from American Prospect, so maybe it's not surprising. They're saying opposite things. But then from economists, one who used to be here, McPherson. You know, this was a debate about the $15 minimum wage, and again, reaching very, won't cost New York jobs. Study California, 400,000 jobs would be lost. What are you supposed to do, right? You're a policymaker, you're confused, you're a member of the public trying to figure out what we should think. You're going to be confused. So the question is far from settled. So a lot of my work is about trying to figure out what's actually going on. I don't have any prior ideological view here. I came to this just because I thought it was an interesting question. I'm interested in what policies help low-income people, help poor families. Minimum wage is obviously a natural one to study, and as I was starting my career, all this minimum wage variation was happening. So I got into this, and a lot of my work since then has been trying to make sense of all the conflicting evidence. I'm going to try to walk you through some of that. And I you know, perfectly honest, you should be, if you don't know, this is contested terrain, so I'm giving you what I think is the objective evidence, but obviously some might have different takes, so if you're interested, you know, read more. So Washer and I, my co-author early on in this work, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things here, did this very extensive review in 2007, 2008 of a slew of studies that had come out using state minimum wages, and we found that, you know, two-thirds, we surveyed over 100 studies. This was not only U.S. studies, sorry. Two-thirds were negative. The estimated employment effects were negative. The ones we subjectively deemed more credible, about 85% of those were negative. The job loss was bigger when the studies focused on a lower skilled group, which is kind of what theory would predict. And a lot of elasticities were in that same -0.1 to -0.2 range. So Washer and I wrote this book after doing a lot of papers on our own, and a lot of other people did papers on our own. And I remember he and I were sitting, he still works at the Fed, we're sitting at the Fed, kind of correcting the, you know, the galleys from the book. And another guy walked in, and he hadn't seen me for a while because I didn't work there anymore, and he said, "What are you guys doing?" And we said, we're correcting the galleys for our minimum wage book, and then we're done with this topic. And he said, you sound like an alcoholic saying this is my last drink. And I did actually stay out of it for a while, but then there was this sort of explosion of research criticizing all this state-level evidence. And the most famous names, you can't see them all, but Dubé is one of them, and the et al. In both of those includes Michael Reich. They basically raised this question, which is a perfectly legitimate question, and it has, I give them credit for spurring researchers, not just to study minimum wages, but any public policy, to think more seriously about where the variation comes from, right? The paradigm we have underlying this kind of research of minimum wage goes up in place A and not place B, and let's see what happens in place A versus place B to tease out the effect, is essentially a paradigm where the policy occurs randomly in place A and not place B. But that's, of course, not how policy happens. Policy is not random. They argued that it was possible. They suggest it was strongly likely. I've never understood why, frankly. That minimum wages go up when kind of low-skilled labor markets are going in the tank. And if that were true, then you would tend to have a bias towards finding that minimum wages reduce employment, but actually employment was already falling when the minimum wage goes up. But what they said is the way to deal with that is to use what I'll give the general label close controls, right? Pick a small area where the minimum wage varies in sort of one part of the area, not the other. We might then be willing to assume that whatever else is changing in the economy that might be driving low-skilled labor market is common on both sides of that, call it a border. And the only thing that's changing is the minimum wage. So we might get sort of cleaner estimation or identification of what the minimum wage is doing. The prototypical paper of this is the Carden-Kruger New Jersey, Pennsylvania paper, which I'm happy to talk about later, but I'm not going to say more about it today. But they also wrote other kinds of papers doing that. And they claimed, this is, that when you do that, when you use this kind of close controls approach, there's no detectable employment losses from minimum wage experiences in the U.S., which is a very different conclusion from the rest of this literature. It's a highly politicized area. If you're interested in digging in this topic, you can go ahead and read and decide how much you think politics inform people's views. I will not I will not comment on that. But I do want to say the following, so I've been wrestling with, okay, so now what do I believe, right? The problem these folks are talking about is a serious problem. The close controls idea sounds reasonable. There's this early paper, it's not that early, by Thomas Holmes in the Journal of Political Economy. He wanted to study the effect of right-to-work laws. And what he does is he looks at, like, I can't remember if it was employment growth or business starts or something, on two sides of borders, near borders, where a right-to-work law gets established on one side and not the other to see what happens. So that research design sounds really compelling. It should be like the kind of what we call exogenous variation we really want. And in fact, there's a bunch of close control papers. They're all here except for one exception. And they tend to find no employment effect of the minimum wage, right? So that approach tends to give you a zero. However, I'm only going to say a little about this. This is a little technical. But there's also a bunch of other papers. This is some examples, which in different ways deal with this problem that where the minimum wage went up might be driven by other stuff going in the economy. These are different empirical strategies that labor economists use, and they all give negative effects, right? Without getting into the why, I think you just have to, the answer, so the point is that it's not whether or not you take account of minimum wages kind of being endogenous or being random or whatever that affects what the conclusion is. It's really whether you use this kind of border control design or not that matters. And that got my colleagues, Ja et al., I'm in that al, thinking about this close controls issue. And while it sounds intuitive, is it really a good idea or isn't it? We have a very complicated paper that argues that this cross-border research is not as good as you think. Let me just give you an example to kind of, the intuition is there and it actually matches up with the technical stuff in the paper. So think about California versus Alabama. California is a high minimum wage. Alabama is still federal minimum wage, right? And now think about Florida, Alabama. Florida borders Alabama, right? Part of it, right? I have my geography right? Okay. So the minimum wage in California is high relative to Alabama, and the minimum wage in Florida is high relative to Alabama. Now, what is a better comparison, California versus Alabama or Florida versus Alabama? And I would argue, and this is what the paper sort of fleshes out in gory detail, that the California versus Alabama variation, that's the kind of experimental variation we want. California's high minimum wages for all kinds of reasons having to do with politics and culture, and nothing to do with the state of the economy last year, right? California's going to have a high minimum wage this year, even if the economy had been going in the toilet for the last few years. And Alabama will probably be the last state to have a minimum wage if it ever does, right? Florida and Alabama, or Arkansas, which also has a minimum wage now, and I'm not going to try to tell you which states Arkansas borders, but I know I'd get some of them right, has a high minimum wage, but I don't believe any of its bordering states do. Maybe one does. And the problem is that you're trying to solve the problem of that minimum wage increases happen maybe because the economy, the low-skilled labor market was trending one way or the other. And when you have states that are very similar culturally, right, and politically and everything else, the reason the minimum wage differs may be exactly because of economic conditions, not in spite of it, whereas why is the minimum wage high in California, not in Alabama, has nothing to do with the business cycle, right? It has to do with a lot of long-standing things. And that intuition actually works. So that's my working model, and the complicated paper says that's true. And these close controls are actually more of a problem, and they create a bias against finding adverse effects of minimum wages. So that's the end of the technical part of the talk. You'll be happy to hear. Okay. There's another part of what is going on in the research literature that I think is interesting, and as I say here, this is weirder, right? So I had a very good graduate student who now runs the equivalent of this, whatever the CBO is called in West Virginia, which he says is great because West Virginia is small enough that he's the expert on everything, right? Not just one thing. He said it's a great job. But he asked me one day, he said, so Dave, you hadn't written a minimum wage employment paper for a while. He said, what does the research literature say? And I said, I don't really know. I mean, I get some papers to referee, I write a few, I read some, but I haven't done a survey. I said, why don't we do it? Why don't we sort of do a comprehensive survey? And we started by sort of looking at these summaries of what people say. And what the thing that is weird here is it's one thing to say my study says X and your study says Y. But it's another thing for Doug to say my study says X when it actually says Y and your study says Y when it actually says X. And what you have in the minimum wage literature is economists not even agreeing on what the summary of the literature is. Not just, I like this study better than that study, fine, that's a legitimate argument. So here's just 3 quotes. Krugman, there's just no evidence that raising the minimum wage costs jobs. Okay, that's pretty clear. Carden-Kruger, I think, what is that, 20th anniversary edition of their book. The literature after our book was about equally likely to find positive and negative employment effects, so split. And then Liu, I can't remember his first name, considerable support for the competitive market hypothesis that an effective minimum wage would result in lower employment. However, a few studies report 0 or even positive effects. So those can't all be true under any circumstances, right? So we sort of set the paper up that way because it seemed genuinely puzzling. And I don't think, I've asked people who work in other areas, does this happen in other areas where people summarizing the same literature just reach very different summaries? And no one has yet produced an example for me. So we did this survey. Don't try to read what's on the left because you can't. So what did we do? We took all the studies since 1992 when people first started using state minimum wage variation. We read the papers to try to figure out the sort of preferred estimate from those papers. We also surveyed the authors and asked them what the preferred estimate was, and we almost always agreed. It was really not much issue, and when we didn't, there was no bias. And sometimes they had a couple estimates because maybe they studied 2 industries or whatever. And this is my favorite graph I ever produced because it's so clear. This is every bar here is an elasticity, right? So here's 0, right? Negative is kind of what I said the surveys tend to show. Positive obviously over there. And when it's dark, really dark, it's significant at the 5% level, the 10% level, and not significant. And I showed my wife this graph, who she knows I'm right, but she still votes for every minimum wage increase in San Francisco because she feels like it should be higher anyways. And she said, oh, I get it, you know. And it's clear here that most studies, whatever those summaries say the minimum wage effect is negative on employment. Now, you could say this one's good, this one's bad, whatever. But that's all you can say, right? But a summary that it's 50-50 or there's no evidence of job loss, you know, basically says ignore all those negative estimates, right? Just out of curiosity, this right here is the Carden-Kruger estimate. So Carden-Kruger does not say there's no effect on employment. It says there's an elasticity above 0.6, which means you raise the minimum wage 10% and employment goes up 6%, which they never actually say in the paper. It's kind of amazing. I just broke my rule. I said more about it. I said I wouldn't. Sorry, you're recording this, and I walked away from the microphone. The really big one, the 1.7 something, the authors of that study, and that if you look at the paper, you can see who it is, but I won't name names, said, we don't really believe that study anymore. Anyways, this is pretty clear evidence, and there's a bunch of other slides, which I'm going to skip through, which basically say this is extraordinarily unlikely to happen if the true effect is 0. It should be kind of obvious. And the effects are bigger when you look at more skilled workers. So things sort of line up this way. Okay, so let me just skip to here. So research on minimum wages and employment, I think this is my last slide on this topic. It is contested. It's not unanimous, but econ is not a lab science. There's no question you would expect all economics studies to point in the same direction. More studies, a greater variety of methods point to job loss. What do we conclude from that survey? That if you want to conclude that the research evidence as a whole fails to find disemployment effects of minimum wages, you've got to basically discard a lot of studies. Now, maybe we should, because maybe a lot of them are wrong. Okay, but we have tackled with this other work I talked about this kind of close controls issue, which is really the papers that are finding no employment effects of the minimum wage, and we think they're getting the wrong answer. Some will disagree. This debate shows no signs of dying down. When I was a first year, my second year of grad school, I took graduate labor. My professor, Jim Medoff, his first lecture was, you know, like a lot of us probably do in our classes, what do labor economists do, right? First PhD course. And he said, I'll just tell you one, and this would have been 84. He said, one thing you should not study is the minimum wage because we know everything about it. And I wasn't going to, but I was at the Fed, and it sort of became an interesting question. But there are so many papers written on this topic, which is why it remains contested and kind of fun to work in, although also a little exhausting. Okay, I'm going to skip these slides. So does the minimum wage help low-wage workers? I got a raise, my boss fired me to pay for their raise. There's a trade-off. Economists always say that there's a trade-off, because there usually is. Okay, so I'm convinced that minimum wages cost some people some jobs. This is a cartoon about the California business lobby, because every year they publish like a top 20 job killers or something, and they always cite the minimum wage. And the point I want to make is just because the minimum wage means there's some job loss doesn't mean it's a bad idea, right? You know, I don't know if I can say this without getting anyone arrested. The policeman left, but you know, climate change is a real problem. Can I say that at a Florida university? I'm not on the payroll, so I can. And climate change policy. I mean, you know, we can disagree a little bit, but I mean, something has to happen, obviously. And if I work in an oil refinery, I'm not going to be happy about that. There's going to be fewer jobs at oil refineries, right? Does that mean we shouldn't try to move the economy away from carbon? Of course not. We have to weigh the costs and benefits, and there's good policies and bad policies. But the point is simply that job loss per se doesn't mean a policy is a bad idea. We have to think about the costs and benefits. Now, is there a benefit to higher minimum wage? Well, this is one of my favorite quotes. Ted Kennedy used to be able to just say Kennedy, but now you have to say Ted Kennedy to not confuse him with you-know-who. He was a perennial sponsor of minimum wage legislation. Every year, introduced a bill to raise the minimum wage, and he was a classic Democratic liberal. He said in his biography, the minimum wage is one of the first and is still one of the best anti-poverty programs we have. So maybe despite some job loss, the fact that a lot of people get a raise and don't lose their job means we reduce poverty, right? Well, do we? So let me show you some data. So the poverty, what I'm showing you here is I'm going to one of the big standard US data sets. I'm defining low-wage workers. It doesn't really matter the exact details. People make less than half the average wage. And I'm showing you in each row, the 85, the 5, et cetera. 85 is the percentage of low-wage workers in you could see from the label, poor families, or less than. We define poverty as the income to needs ratio. So if you're exactly 1, your income is exactly the poverty line. If your income to needs ratio is 3, you're 3 times above the poverty line, et cetera. 85% of low-wage workers are in poor families, and you can read down the list. And if you looked at this, you'd say, wow, the minimum wage is a really good way to help low-income families, right? Because when the wage goes up, maybe there's some job loss, sure, but a lot of that, all that increased wage bill is going to go to poor families. The problem is this is 1939, okay? And here's what the data look like now. Look at the top row, right? 85, 42, it's going 20 years and then every decade roughly. 85, 42, 20, 16, 13, I think it's high, 16. So currently, roughly currently, a couple years ago, only 16% of low-wage workers are in low-income families. And look at the bottom number, 37% are in families 3 times the poverty line or higher, which is about median income. So who the heck is a minimum wage worker in an above-average income family? So how many of you had minimum wage jobs in high school? Okay. How many of you are or were in families with above median income, which is only like 55,000, like all of you, right? Probably at a college, at a good university mostly, right? And that's the point, right? Who is a low-wage worker and who is in a low-income family? Pretty disconnected, not completely disconnected, obviously, right? But pretty weakly connected. The minimum wage is a very lousy way to get money into the hands of poor families. Now, why did it used to be so much more effective? First of all, pretty much the only people who worked were men and single women. Married women often had, you may not know this, often had to leave jobs when they got married, certainly got pregnant. And there was no safety net. And there was no minimum wage, so you worked or you were hungry. Now, of course, we have a lot of secondary, tertiary workers and families, spouses, kids. We have you can decide how generous you think it is. We have a safety net that provides a lot of resources to families. We do let people go homeless, but we don't let people starve in the streets. I mean, we have a lot of programs to help people. Some are disconnected from the system, but in general, there's a lot of money from the government to help families. And as a result, there's actually a lot of poor families with working-age adults who have no workers. So there's a bunch of reasons the minimum wage doesn't really target poor families very well. First of all, a lot of minimum wage workers are not in poor families. Second of all, a lot of minimum wage workers work low hours. So even if we raise the wage, it doesn't do much. And third, a lot of poor families have 0 workers. And raising the minimum wage, if you're not working, doesn't do any good. So this is from, I wrote an op-ed about this. The Wall Street Journal draws cartoons, and it's a little blurry, but you can see Obama. This was back when they were debating a 10 minimum wage, throwing all these bills in the poor families. They don't get any in the cartoon, which is an exaggeration, but it's the Wall Street Journal, so what do you expect? But the point is, you can see these, I don't know if you can tell, it's blurry. These folks are out here are holding bundles of cash, so you can see that here. And these folks aren't getting much, or in the Wall Street Journal's view, aren't getting any. But it does make the point about targeting. Okay, does the minimum wage reduce poverty anyways? And the answer is no, it doesn't. There's quite a bit of statistical evidence. There's one outlier study, but a lot of research that says there's really no statistical association. And it's partly because of the poor targeting, and partly, of course, because of the job loss. But it's kind of a wash. It doesn't increase poverty. It's just a wash. You really can't find an impact. So I characterize the minimum wage, and I have some evidence of this more direct, that it kind of moves money around between low-income families. Some make a little more, some make a little less, but doesn't really do much for them. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. We can come back to it. I just want to make this one point. This is from a paper by Tom McCurdy. Who consumes, remember I said at the beginning, the minimum wage raises costs in industries where they use a lot of low-skilled labor. Well, who consumes more of that stuff? Low-income people, not high-income people, right? Minimum wages do more to raise the price of Happy Meals than yachts, right, for sure. So I'm going to skip this. I just want to, I'll put my pointer down because I'm getting the time limit here, but I could talk more in the Q&A. All of this is about redistribution, right? We are having discussions of these policies because the U.S., like every other rich country, pays some attention to making sure low-income families have more resources than maybe the labor market would deliver on its own, because we decide that's not enough. And we do it in different ways, but we do it here, they do it in Europe, they do it in other places too. These are all forms of redistribution. So as redistribution policy, I think the minimum wage really doesn't work very well, and the EITC works very well. And I wish I had the slide, because I have this great picture of AOC on here. But I don't, in her I don't know what's going on here. Forward. Here she is. This was at the Met Gala, right? The Eat the Rich, the Tax the Rich, dress. I put this up at Hoover, and I said, I'm pretty sure no one has ever put her picture up in a lecture, but she's right. I mean, if we're going to do redistribution, tax the rich. I wish she'd said, and don't raise the minimum wage, but she's not going to say that. But the point is, that's how redistribution policy should work, whatever level of it you're going to choose, and that's not what's happening with the minimum wage. And that's why fundamentally I think, A, it's not a great idea, and B, it's easy to say that's not a good idea, but we actually have a better idea that works well, and we could make it more generous. The last thing I'll say is politicians love the minimum wage because they don't have to come up with the money. We do. They just pass the law. Make the EITC more generous, they have to raise taxes, right? And there's a lot of constraints on doing that. And the minimum wage, I think, is often the easy way out to say we're doing something about inequality, even if it's not working and even if the rich aren't the ones paying for it. Thanks.
Let's see here. Is this working? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have a question, I think that we have some IGC folks that will come over and bring the microphone to you. So just go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll allow Dr. Neumark to call on.
Good. There's two here. They might have the same question. We'll find out.
When you say it encourages work, you mean like in theory, like if someone's already working and then they get an additional, like added, onto their paycheck from the government, another $20,000. Yeah, they have to keep working in order to be eligible for that. But I mean, can an argument be made that they'd work less because they're getting more? I mean,
it's an empirical statement, and it's what economists call the extensive margin, right? Yeah, if I give a working person income, a lump sum check, that's in general going to reduce labor supply. And there's a little bit of reduction in hours. It's not very strong in the data of the people who are already working, but you see entry, right? And this is always the labor supply problem I put on my undergraduate labor course, right? We tend to say that the effect of higher wages on labor supply is ambiguous. There's income and substitution effects. But on the extensive margin, if you're not working, it isn't, because there's only a substitution effect. Leisure, if I'm going to subsidize your wage by 40%, leisure has just gotten 40% more expensive. So there's a lot of entry into the labor market because of the EITC. And the remarkable thing about it, and this is like the magic dust part of the EITC, you know, it's not magic to give people money and, you know, lo and behold, the poverty rate is lower. But the EITC lowers the poverty rate before you factor in the EITC payment. So there's enough increased labor supply that families are actually earning their way out of poverty, and then of course they're getting more money, which, you know, which does that further.
Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
So there's a term in your slides that was new to me, and it brings to mind two questions that are related to each other. Non-binding minimum wages, you know, the fact that a wage level will differ depending on the cost of living across areas. I'm wondering if you would agree if a problem of the close comparison studies like the Kruger and Card study is the fact that it doesn't, the bindingness level, I'm not sure how you'd say it, is the same with close comparisons, and that's a lack of variation there. The reason why I ask is when you were showing all of these charts, like number of states with a minimum wage higher than the federal level, I also wondered if the bindingness, like the cost of living, if that gives you an additional source of variation.
Sure.
That either needs to be controlled for or you adjust a variable with it. And if these close comparison studies, if they're simply unable to deal with, so for example, in Card and Kruger, I think the minimum wage went up by like $50 or something. This was in the early 90s. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I was just wondering, well, if the costs of living are the same across the river in Philadelphia,
Right. So, yeah.
then there's no variation in bindingness.
Right.
And so how would we, so yeah, the two questions, do we have an additional source because of bindingness that we can't necessarily observe directly, or we need proxies for it, and is that a flaw with the close comparison studies?
Right. So I don't think it's a problem with the close comparison settings, because those places usually do have more similar wage levels. Most studies now, before they move on to look at employment or hours, will ask the question, does the minimum wage actually raise wages or earnings, depending on what's in the data? And if it doesn't, there's not much point asking the next question, right? So I think, you know, in general, studies are pretty good about that, and Card and Kruger do that as well. They have other problems. It is a useful source of variation, and people use it. So when I talked about this, this fact, you know, this critique coming out of the Dubé and Reich and other work that minimum wages are adopted, maybe dependent on economic conditions, and I said there's other solutions than close controls. So one of them is to say, let's take the state minimum wage, but let's look within regions in the state and say, okay, the California minimum wage goes up statewide. That pushes labor costs up a tiny bit in San Francisco and a huge amount of the Central Valley. So let's just look within state, right, which is not correlated with the minimum wage change because it is adopted statewide. And that kind of variation tends to replicate negative employment effects. So I'm forgetting his first name, Thompson, who used to be at the Fed, he might still be there, has this, Matthew Thompson, it's nice, not Matthew Thompson, doesn't matter. A paper like that where he kind of does he sort of varies the treatment intensity based on wage levels and finds very strong evidence that, you know, exactly where the minimum wage pushes wages up more is where you see more of a labor demand response.
Well, thanks for the talk. I was curious about your thoughts on the incidence of the EITC, because I think there's been I'm thinking of the Rothstein paper about how employers maybe don't need to, because of that increased labor supply that can bid down the wage. How do you think about the interaction between the minimum wage and the EITC? Because I think some people might say, well, you have a very low floor and then an EITC on top of it.
Right. So that's a different incidence question. I'll come back to that in a second. So, so you get this critique of the EITC that says it's corporate welfare, right? Rothstein doesn't say this. He's smarter than that, right? So what does the EITC do? The EITC increases labor supply. That's the extensive margin response we were talking about. In and of itself, that lowers the market wage. So we didn't have a minimum wage. The EITC would go up, market wages would fall because the labor supply shifts out, although workers' take-home pay goes up because they get the wage plus the money from the government. And some folks say, oh, we have to implement a minimum wage along with the EITC to sort of offset that. but then you won't get the employment increase. I mean, I've always found this argument a little puzzling. And that's the sense in which I kind of think Rothstein's views on this are misplaced. I did a paper a while back, Washer and I did a paper, where we tried to get at this question, though, of what happens when you change them together. And you get this sort of interesting result that you get sort of a positive interaction, as we say, or multiplier when you raise them both, on some people, not others. The people who work more when you raise them together are single mothers. The people who work less are female teenagers, male teenagers to some extent, minorities. And what's going on, I think, is that you have some people who have very high value of time, namely mothers, right? Working, maybe they just value the time because they want to take care of their kids, or it may be that it's expensive to work because you need childcare. So for whatever reason, you need things that together raise the effective wage a lot to induce them to work. Of course, when they do, the people who otherwise have those jobs have more competition, and frankly, the teenage women or girls are less skilled than the 30-year-old single mother, so they end up losing their jobs. So you get this trade-off. It's an interesting kind of, here's where theory gives you sort of an interesting insight. So you might say, oh, that's great, right? We can reduce poverty. I mean, single mothers tend to be the very high incidence of being poor, of course. And it's great, we get them working, but then you say, well, wait a second, from a social planner's perspective, whose time out of the labor market is worth a lot? Well, women with small kids. Whose time out of the labor market is worth nothing? Teenage boys. I mean, God, they're just playing video games. So wouldn't it be better if they worked and the mother stayed home and took care of their kids? But, that's not the way so from a welfare perspective, that may be right. Policymakers don't think like that. We tend to think, and I get it. Our problem is that some families are low income, and we can hopefully all agree that that's really a problem when there's kids. In the US, we tend to think poverty is more of a choice than in Western Europe, right? But it might be a choice of the adult. That's not, the 5-year-old isn't poor because they chose not to work, right? So, we are trying to get more money into the hands of low-income families, not to get more time into the time and budget constraints of low-income families. So I think invariably we're still going to keep evaluating policies based on, what kind of income transfers it generates. Economists love to do welfare analysis. I talk to policymakers a lot. Some of you may. They never talk. If you start talking about welfare to them, their eyes will glaze over. They say, I have a problem I want to solve. I want the poverty rate to be lower. I want the employment rate to be higher. I want kids to have, a given level of resource in their family. Convince me the policy does that. Convince me the policy doesn't do that. And I'll either support it or maybe change our mind. But they're not doing welfare analysis.
All right, so we've hit the end point on this. Before we give Dr. Neumark another round of applause, I just want to point out that the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics student group is here at FSU, and they're actually, as an economist, I have to say there's no such thing as a free lunch, but you can get
except when you're a student.
Yeah, well, you can get a slice for zero price if you go upstairs, because they're going to be having pizza and continuing this conversation about the minimum wage and talking about how effective it is as a poverty tool. Sounds like not very. Can I ask just one more question?
You're in charge.
Okay. Does the minimum wage hit some groups harder than others?
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly hits low-skilled people harder than others, and I talked about why, and I never talked about the slide, but never mind. And I flew through some evidence on that. I'm given a paper tomorrow in the econ department which asks a question which you would have. It's a really simple question. It's kind of a simple paper. You would have thought would have been asked with all these hundreds of papers written, which is, does the effect fall more strongly on minorities? Because they are unmeasurable factors, both schooling and age. Less skilled, they have less schooling, and blacks are younger than whites, and Latinos to some extent in this country. And controlling for those things, they're probably also less skilled, lower quality schools, et cetera. So you might think the minimum wage, and the wages are lower, right? So minimum wage will be more binding. So we have this paper, and we have this really striking result, which I have been, I wouldn't say trying to make go away, but trying to stress test it as much as I can, because it's pretty controversial. But the employment effects in this paper, we don't do Latinos because it's sort of, gets complicated with legal status, but we do blacks and whites, and the adverse effects fall almost entirely on low-skilled blacks, not low-skilled whites, which says they're, you know, I mean, we basically end up saying the minimum wage is increasing race disparities, which is not something, I expected to find slightly bigger effects for blacks, maybe not statistically significant, but the evidence would point that way in a little direction. Like the effects are close to zero for whites, and the elasticities for blacks are about roughly double or more the elasticity I've been showing you here. And it still kind of floors me and also makes me nervous because I gave this at Hoover and John Cochran said, oh, so now Neumark's saying the minimum wage is the new Jim Crow. I'm like, oh God, don't say that, you know. But we've been beating this up, my grad student and I, for really close to a year since we sort of first got it, and it ain't going anywhere. So we'll see what influence this has on debate. I don't know. But, you know, that said, when there aren't a lot of papers on a topic, you should always be very cautious until there's more. Thank you very much. Thank you.